What does the Hulk, huge nuts, and L. Ron Hubbard have in common? They're all part of a weird sciencey fact that boggles my mind. Now, I'm sure you've heard of GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And while the modern world has been mass modifying genetic organisms with precision to get specific traits, man's earlier foray into modifying and mutating organisms was something you'd imagine coming out of a comic book. It was called atomic gardening, and it's exactly what you'd think that would be. See, back in the 1920s, scientists had a habit of doing weird shit just to see what would happen. It wasn't always super scientific, but it sure was fun. After all, it was the roaring 20s, and apparently consuming massive amounts of bootleg liquor and legal cocaine can lead to some interesting ideas. And apparently one of those ideas was just subjecting barley to massive amounts of X-ray radiation for some reason. And what they found out was this ended up mutating the barley, and the barley was actually able to pass those mutated genes on to the next generation. Then in 1945, we finished building a really big bomb and used it to blow up Japan. And with that, the age of the atom ensued, and people got really excited about radiation. Like, seriously, they're like, let's just put radioactive stuff in and on everything. And no joke, they put it in toothpaste for a while and marketed it as atomic toothpaste. They said it helped kill germs and increase circulation. We painted clock faces and dials with radioactive material so it would glow in the dark. Unfortunately, the girls whose job it was to paint radium on stuff had some really unfortunate side effects from that. But the 20th century was all about learning firsthand all the new ways that stuff could kill us. Like, who knew smoking and asbestos were bad for you? But anyway, one such fascination with radiation involved just subjecting seeds and plants to massive amounts of it. A lot of times this would just involve planting these circular gardens around radioactive material like cobalt-60 and just seeing what would happen. Usually what would happen is the plants closest to the radiation would die, and the plants a little bit further away in that ring would have wished they died, but the plants furthest away got their genes scrambled in all kinds of fun and fascinating ways and survived. Some of those fun and fascinating ways were actually practical. As a result, governments and scientific bodies around the world started popping up to analyze atomic agriculture. But the practice hadn't really popped into popular culture until a man popped out some big nuts in an effort to impress a woman. And that might sound like harassment, but this was 1958. It was a different time. They were also peanuts, and this was before peanut allergies were a big thing too. A man at North Carolina State University exposed a couple 100 pounds of peanuts to some massive radiation, and then planting his peanuts resulted in them growing into some massive peanuts. And he thought it'd be fun to show off his massive peanuts to his friend Muriel Howarth, who was very impressed and secretly fed them to some of her dinner guests, who were less impressed. They didn't really seem to care. So then she planted the peanuts, and they germinated in a couple days and grew into a couple foot tall peanut plants with some massive peanuts, and that caught the attention of the public. It also caught the attention of L. Ron Hubbard. And if that name sounds familiar but can't quite put your finger on it, it's the dude that Tom Cruise worships. He was the man who came up with Scientology. And in 1957, Hubbard wrote a book called All About Radiation, where he claimed that he was a nuclear scientist. He wasn't. He was a nuclear scientist, kind of like a can of Dr. Pepper as a general surgeon. But anyway, the public fascination began. And Muriel, who was so impressed with the doctor's big nuts, decided she was going to make a fan club for them called the Atomic Gardening Society. And this is where it went from something that was being done by scientists and governments to something that was being done by bored housewives and random people who enjoyed playing with lethal amounts of radiation. In fact, in 1957, this guy named Clarence wrote to the Atomic Energy Commission and was like, hey, could I have some radioactive samples? Like, he's strolling through the frozen food section of a Costco. And the U.S. government's just like, yeah, sure, I don't see why not. And if you're wondering what Clarence's credentials were, he was a dentist. Apparently, they just give the shit away to anybody. So anyway, Clarence gets his cobalt, and he makes his concrete bunker in his backyard in the middle of Tennessee, and proceeds to try to start the little pet shop of horrors by blasting seeds and plants to massive amounts of radiation. And then he just proceeded to start selling the seeds. He sold like 3.5 million seeds to the Atomic Gardening Society. The fucking 50s and 60s, man. What a time to be alive. As a result of planting Spee's seeds, they ended up growing some pretty cool stuff. In fact, this practice, which still goes on today, has created or mutated 2,700 plants. You've probably consumed some of the fruits of their labor yourself. Some grapefruit that were created in the same fashion of Godzilla make up 70% of Texas's grapefruit crop. If you're like Ron Burgundy and you love scotch, or any good whiskey, and consumed any that was distilled in the 70s and 80s, there's a good chance that it was distilled with Golden Promise barley. And if it was, that means you've drank some whiskey that was the result of radiation. Flaxseed from Australia, and one of the most common types of of rice grown in California share comic book superhero type origin stories as well. And while much of the developed world today has switched to very specific genetic modification for GMOs, rather than relying on the spray and pray method of atomic mutations, radiation farming is still common practice in much of the developing world as a way to help address food scarcity and food stability. And while this all sounds alarming, you shouldn't be worried about munching on mutated mangoes or appetizing on atomic apples or relishing in some radioactive raspberries, because they are all perfectly safe. None of these crops retain that radiation and become themselves radioactive. Like the Hulk or Spider-Man, the radiation has simply mutated them into something hopefully helpful. And those mutations are just subsequently passed along to all future generations. So they're perfectly safe, except for maybe the person who first did the radiation. Seems like kind of a dangerous job to let a dentist do. But the fact that we let him and others do it means that we've developed plants that are more resistant to pests and drought, that grow faster and produce bigger yield, and not only have helped to meet the demand for food and agricultural products in the past, but will continue to be crucial in the future as climate change and population booms create new challenges in food stability. And the fact that the relationship between radiation and things like radishes and raspberries can radically realign their ability to replenish their rations, well, that is pretty mind-boggling.